Eleanor Whitmore stood outside the study door with her hand raised and could not knock. Behind that door sat a man she was supposed to marry in 11 hours. A man whose name she had heard 100 times before she ever saw his face. Duke Sebastian Ashworth. Wealthy beyond counting, powerful beyond question, and utterly completely a stranger to her. Her hand fell to her side. She had rehearsed this moment for 3 nights straight, whispering the words into her pillow until they lost all meaning. Now standing in the cold hallway with candlelight flickering against the stone walls, every rehearsed word had abandoned her. She knocked anyway. "Enter," came the voice from within, calm, steady, the voice of a man who had never once in his life doubted that people would do as he asked. Eleanor pushed the door open and stepped inside. The Duke sat behind a wide desk, covered in papers, a glass of amber liquid untouched at his elbow. He looked up, and for a moment, something crossed his face that she could not name. Surprise, perhaps, or something closer to relief. "Miss Whitmore," he said, rising, "I did not expect a visit tonight. I did not expect to make one." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "But I could not let tomorrow arrive without saying what I came to say." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She did not sit. "Then say it." Eleanor's hands twisted together in front of her skirts. 3 years of managing her family's estate alone had taught her many things, but never how to look a duke in the eye and ask him to release her from a promise that had never truly been hers to give. "Don't marry me," she said. The words hung in the room like smoke that would not clear. The Duke did not move. He did not laugh, as she had feared he might. He did not grow cold and distant, as she had also feared. He simply stood there, watching her with an expression she could not read, and said nothing at all. "I know what you must think of me," Eleanor continued, the words spilling out now that the first ones had broken free. "A woman standing in your study the night before her wedding, begging to be released. It is not proper. It is not what a lady does. But I have spent my whole life doing what is proper, Your Grace, and it has brought my family nothing but debt and silence, and a father who sold my future to settle his mistakes." Still, the Duke said nothing. "I do not dislike you," she said, softer now. "I hardly know you well enough to dislike you, but I have seen what marriages built on convenience do to women. I watched it happen to my own mother. She smiled at dinner parties and wept alone in her rooms, and by the time she died, I do not think she remembered what her own laughter sounded like. I will not become her, not even for a title, not even to save my family's name." The silence stretched long enough that Eleanor began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake by coming here at all. Then the Duke spoke. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore." It was not a command this time. It was something closer to a request. She sat, finally, in the chair across from him, her spine straight, her hands folded tight in her lap. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark garden below, his back to her. "Do you know why I agreed to this marriage?" he asked. "For an heir, for land, for whatever reasons men of your position marry." Her voice held no accusation, only tiredness. "No," he said. "Those were my father's reasons, when he arranged it years ago, before either of us had any say in the matter. I kept the arrangement standing for a different reason entirely." Eleanor waited. Something in his tone had shifted, and she found she did not want to interrupt it. "There was a woman," the Duke said, "years before you and I ever exchanged a single letter, a woman I loved in the foolish, complete way that young men love before life teaches them better. Her name was Margaret." He said the name the way a person touches an old wound to see if it still hurts. "She died before we could marry. A fever," the physician said, "though I have always believed grief, killed her as surely as any illness. Her family had opposed the match, and the strain of it wore her down until there was nothing left to fight with. I watched it happen and could do nothing to stop it." Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen slightly, some tight coil she had not known she was carrying. "After that," he continued, "I decided I would never again let my heart choose anything for me. My father's arrangement with your family became convenient in a way I had not expected. A marriage with no expectation of love meant a marriage with no risk of losing anyone the way I lost her. I told myself this was wisdom. I have told myself that for a very long time. He turned from the window to face her. And then you walked into my study tonight and told me you refuse to become a woman who smiles at dinners and weeps alone. Do you understand what that means to a man who has spent years building a life specifically designed to avoid feeling anything strongly enough to lose it? Eleanor did not answer. She was not certain there was an answer to give. It means, the Duke said quietly, that for the first time since Margaret died, someone in my life is telling me the truth instead of what she thinks I want to hear, and I find that I do not know what to do with it. The candle on his desk sputtered, throwing shadows across the papers scattered there. Neither of them moved to fix it. I did not come here for a confession, Your Grace, Eleanor finally said. I came here to ask for my freedom. I know. He came around the desk and stood closer to her than propriety strictly allowed. But you deserve to understand the man you are asking to release you, before you decide whether release is truly what you want. It does not change my answer. Perhaps not. His eyes held hers, steady and searching. But I find I am no longer certain it changes mine. Eleanor's breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. What do you mean? The Duke was quiet for a long moment, as though weighing words he had never expected to need. I mean that tomorrow morning, when the contracts are brought before us, I do not think I will sign them the way either of us expected. The words landed strangely in the room, both a relief and a new kind of uncertainty, and Eleanor found herself unable to say which one weighed heavier. She left his study that night without a clear answer, only a promise that morning would bring one, and the strange, unsettled feeling that the man behind that desk was not at all the man she had been told to expect. The household stirred before dawn, though Eleanor had not slept. She lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to servants moving through the halls below, carrying linens and flowers meant for a wedding that might not happen at all. Her lady's maid, a quiet girl named Beatrice, arrived just after sunrise to help her dress, though Eleanor waved away the wedding gown hanging pressed and waiting on its stand. Not yet, Eleanor said. Something simpler, please. Beatrice's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing, choosing instead a plain morning dress, the color of weak tea, and helping Eleanor into it with steady, practiced hands. Is everything well, miss? Beatrice finally asked, unable to hold her tongue any longer. I am not entirely certain, Eleanor admitted. I went to the Duke's study last night. Beatrice's hands stilled on the buttons at Eleanor's back. You didn't. I did. And? Eleanor caught her own reflection in the small mirror on the dressing table, a young woman with tired eyes and a jaw set with something like resolve. And I do not yet know what I have set in motion. Downstairs, the house had already begun to fill with the particular chaos of a wedding day. Eleanor's aunt, a sharp-tongued woman named Charlotte, who had taken over the household arrangements since Eleanor's mother's passing, moved through the rooms, barking instructions at footmen carrying chairs, at maids arranging flowers, at anyone unfortunate enough to cross her path. There you are, Charlotte said when she spotted Eleanor descending the stairs. The contracts arrive within the hour. You look pale, girl. Eat something. I am not hungry. You will eat something, Charlotte repeated, in the tone that had never once in Eleanor's life allowed for argument. Because a bride who faints during her own contract signing gives the family a reputation we cannot afford. Eleanor allowed herself to be steered toward the breakfast room, though the food sat untouched before her, while her mind turned over every word the Duke had spoken the night before. Margaret, the fever that grief had made worse, a man who had built an entire life around never feeling anything strongly enough to lose it again. And his final words, spoken so quietly, she still was not certain she had heard them correctly. I do not think I will sign them the way either of us expected. What did that mean? That he would refuse the marriage entirely, releasing her as she had asked? Or something else, something she had not allowed herself to consider through the long, sleepless hours of the night? A commotion at the front of the house pulled her from her thoughts. Voices, raised but not angry, the particular sound of important people arriving somewhere important. Eleanor rose from the table before Charlotte could stop her and made her way toward the entrance hall. The Duke stood there, dressed not in the formal attire she expected for a contract signing, but in simple traveling clothes, as though prepared for a journey rather than a wedding. Beside him stood his solicitor, a thin, nervous man named Edmund Price, clutching a leather folio to his chest. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, stopping several steps away, "I did not expect you so early." "I did not wish to wait," the Duke said. "There are things that should be settled before the household grows too large with witnesses." Charlotte appeared behind Eleanor, drawn by the commotion, and beside her came Eleanor's father, a stooped gray man named William Whitmore, who had aged a decade in the 3 years since his wife's death. "Your Grace," William said, bowing slightly, though his eyes carried the particular desperation of a man whose entire financial future depended on this marriage proceeding as planned. "The contracts are prepared. We had thought to sign within the hour, as arranged." "About that," the Duke said, the room seemed to hold its breath. "I have made a decision overnight," the Duke continued, "regarding the terms of this marriage. I would like to discuss it with Miss Whitmore directly, and with her father, before anything further proceeds." William's face drained of what little color remained in it. "Your Grace, if there is some concern regarding the estate's debts, I assure you, this has nothing to do with debts, Mr. Whitmore." The Duke's eyes found Eleanor's across the entrance hall, and something in his expression softened the formal edges of his words. "This has to do with the fact that your daughter came to my study last night and asked me not to marry her." A collective gasp moved through the small gathered crowd of servants and family members. Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth. William stared at his daughter as though seeing her for the first time. "Eleanor," her father said, voice cracking, "what have you done?" "I told the truth," Eleanor said, lifting her chin, "something this family has apparently forgotten how to do." "You will ruin us," William hissed. "Do you understand what you have done? Do you understand what happens to this family if the Duke walks away? Mr. Whitmore," the Duke's voice cut through the room, quiet but unmistakably firm, "I would ask you to remember whose daughter you are speaking to, and whose future you have spent the last 3 years bargaining away without once asking her opinion of the matter." William fell silent, though his face had gone an unhealthy shade of red. The Duke turned back to Eleanor, and the room around them seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the two of them and the weight of everything unsaid between them since the previous night. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I told you last night that I did not think I would sign the contracts the way anyone expected. I meant that." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment, then. The moment he released her, freed her from an arrangement she had never wanted, and sent her back into a life of uncertain debts and an uncertain future, but at least a future of her own choosing. She had wanted this. She had asked for this. So why did her chest feel as though something was breaking rather than mending? "I have instructed Mr. Price to draw up new terms," the Duke continued, nodding toward his nervous solicitor. "Terms that reflect what I believe should have been the foundation of this arrangement from the very beginning." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, holding it out not to her father, but to Eleanor herself. "What is this?" she asked, taking it with trembling fingers. "Read it," he said, "and then tell me if it changes anything." Eleanor unfolded the paper with hands that did not want to cooperate, and began to read words that would change the entire shape of the morning, and every morning that followed after it. The paper trembled slightly in her grip as her eyes moved across the careful handwriting. It was not a standard marriage contract. There was no mention of dowries or land transfers, no clauses about heirs or inheritance, structured the way her father had described them to her weeks ago with such nervous relief. Instead, the document began with a single clause that made her breath catch. "The undersigned Duke agrees that this marriage, should it proceed, will grant Miss Eleanor Whitmore full and unconditional right to dissolve the arrangement at any point within the first year, without penalty to her family's estate, and without any further obligation on her part." She read it twice, to be certain she had understood correctly. "You are giving me a way out," she said quietly, looking up at him. "After everything." "I am giving you a choice," the Duke corrected, "which is different from a way out. A way out assumes you wish to leave. A choice simply means the decision remains yours, today and every day after, rather than something signed away the moment ink touches paper." William Whitmore stepped forward, his composure cracking further. "Your Grace, this is highly unusual. No contract of marriage grants such terms. If word of this reaches other families, then word will reach them," the Duke said, without looking away from Eleanor. "I find I care very little what other families think of terms designed to give a woman honesty instead of a cage." Charlotte, who had remained silent through much of the exchange, finally spoke, her voice unusually soft. "Eleanor, what do you wish to do?" Every eye in the entrance hall turned toward her, the servants pretending not to listen while listening intently. Her father, pale and desperate. Her aunt, waiting with an expression Eleanor had never seen on her before, something almost like hope, and the Duke himself, standing perfectly still, giving her the space to answer without pressure of any kind, though she could see the tension held tight in his shoulders. Eleanor looked down at the paper again, at the clause that gave her back the one thing she had never truly possessed in this entire arrangement, her own agency. "I would like to speak with the Duke alone," she said finally, "if that is permitted." Charlotte ushered the gathered household back toward the breakfast room, despite William's protests, and within moments, the entrance hall emptied until only Eleanor and Sebastian remained, standing several feet apart in the cool morning light filtering through the tall windows. "You did not have to do this," Eleanor said. "I know. Why did you?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer with the same care he seemed to give everything. "Because last night, for the first time in years, someone looked at me and told me something true instead of something convenient. I have spent so long protecting myself from ever feeling anything strongly enough to lose it again that I forgot what it felt like to be spoken to honestly. I do not wish to lose that, Eleanor, even if losing you is the price required to keep it." Her name, spoken without the formal title, landed differently than she expected. Softer, more dangerous somehow. "You barely know me," she said. "I know that you would rather face ruin than live a lie. I know that you drove to my study in the dark, rather than let tomorrow arrive without honesty between us. I know that you have carried your family's entire future on your shoulders for 3 years without once asking for help, and that you still had the courage to ask me for something for yourself." He took a step closer. "I do not think that is nothing, Eleanor. I think that might be everything." Eleanor's throat tightened. She had come to this house prepared for rejection, for release, for the particular relief of walking away from a marriage she had never chosen. She had not prepared herself for a man who listened, who changed, who handed her freedom instead of demanding her silence. "If I sign this," she said slowly, "what happens? Whatever you decide happens. If you wish to marry me today and dissolve the arrangement next month, that is your right. If you wish to marry me and discover, in time, that you do not despise my company, that is also your right. The terms exist to protect your choice, not to predict its outcome. And if I choose not to marry you at all, today, this morning, before any contracts are signed." The Duke's expression did not waver, though something flickered behind his eyes that suggested the question cost him more than his composure let on. "Then I will instruct Mr. Price to settle your father's debts regardless," he said, quietly and without condition. "You do not have to marry me for that concern to be resolved, Eleanor. That was never meant to be the price of your honesty." Eleanor stared at him, searching his face for the deception she had been taught to expect from men of his position, the hidden clause, the trick meant to bind her regardless of what she chose. She found none of it, only a man standing in a cold entrance hall offering her something no one in her life had ever offered before. The freedom to choose him or not, without consequence either way. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. "Settle the debts without requiring anything of me?" Because I find I would rather have your honesty for one morning than your silence for a lifetime, he said. Margaret taught me that lesson the hard way, though I did not understand it until last night. I let her family's disapproval and her own fear keep her silent about how much the strain was costing her, and by the time I understood what silence had done, there was nothing left to save. I will not make that mistake again, not with you, not with anyone. The morning light shifted through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor between them. Eleanor thought of her mother, smiling through dinners and weeping through nights, trapped in a silence that had slowly hollowed her out until nothing remained. She thought of the 3 years she had spent managing debts and disappointments alone, never once allowed the luxury of asking what she herself wanted, and she thought of the man standing before her now, who had taken her plea for freedom and turned it into something she had never expected, not a rejection, not an argument, a choice, freely given, with no strings attached to bind her regardless of her answer. I need time, she said finally. Not forever, but more than the hour my father has planned for signing contracts. Then you shall have it, the Duke said immediately. Take the day, take the week, if you need it. I will wait for your answer whenever it comes. Eleanor folded the paper carefully and held it against her chest, as though it were something fragile that required protecting. Thank you, she said, and meant it more deeply than the simple words could carry. She turned to leave the entrance hall, her mind already racing through the walk she intended to take through the gardens, the quiet she needed to hear her own thoughts clearly for the first time in days. But the Duke's voice stopped her at the threshold. Eleanor, she turned back. Whatever you decide, he said, I want you to know that coming to my study last night was the bravest thing anyone has done in my presence in a very long time. Regardless of your answer, that will not change. Eleanor left the house through the side garden door rather than face the breakfast room full of waiting relatives, her father's anxious questions, her aunt's careful watching. She needed air. She needed distance from the weight of everyone else's expectations pressing against her chest like stones. The garden had not yet fully bloomed, early summer roses still tight in their buds along the stone pathways, but the morning air carried the cool green scent of growing things, and Eleanor breathed it in like something she had been starved of for years. She walked without direction, following the winding paths past the old fountain that no longer worked properly, past the hedge maze her mother had loved wandering through in the years before illness took the joy from her, until she reached the small stone bench at the garden's edge, overlooking the valley beyond the estate's boundaries. She sat there for a long time, the paper still clutched in her hands, reading the words over and over until they blurred together into something she understood not with her mind, but with something deeper and more uncertain. A choice. Her mother had never had one. Her father had made this arrangement without once considering that she might want something different for herself. And now a duke, a man she had known for barely a handful of formal meetings before last night, had handed her the one thing no one else in her life had ever thought to offer. The sound of footsteps on gravel pulled her from her thoughts. She turned, expecting her aunt come to check on her, or perhaps a servant sent to fetch her back to the house. Instead, she found a woman she did not recognize, dressed in traveling clothes dusted from a long journey, standing at the edge of the garden path with an expression of careful uncertainty. "Forgive the intrusion," the woman said. "I was told I might find Miss Whitmore here." "I am Eleanor Whitmore." The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly, though something in her posture remained tense, guarded. "My name is Grace Ashworth. I am the Duke's sister." Eleanor rose from the bench, smoothing her skirts, uncertain of the proper etiquette for an unexpected meeting in a garden with the sister of the man she was supposed to be marrying within the day. "I did not know the Duke had a sister," Eleanor admitted. "Not many do. I have lived quietly in the countryside for some years now, away from society and its particular cruelties." Grace's eyes, the same steady gray as her brother's, studied Eleanor with an intensity that felt less like judgment and more like recognition. "I came as soon as I received word of what happened last night. I felt you deserved to hear certain things directly from someone who has known my brother his entire life, rather than pieced together from servants' gossip or society's assumptions. Grace glanced back toward the house, as though checking they were truly alone, before settling onto the stone bench beside Eleanor. "Things about Margaret," she said quietly. "Things my brother may not have told you, because even now, years later, the full truth of what happened still costs him more than he lets anyone see." Eleanor sat back down slowly, her heart beating with a strange mixture of dread and desperate curiosity. "He told me she died, a fever, made worse by her family's disapproval of their match." "That is true," Grace said. "But it is not the whole truth, and I think, before you decide anything about the arrangement my brother has offered you, you deserve to understand exactly what kind of man asked you to make this choice, and exactly what it cost him to become that man in the first place." The wind moved through the garden, carrying the scent of roses not yet fully bloomed, and Eleanor found herself leaning forward, waiting for whatever truth Grace Ashworth had traveled so far to deliver. "My brother did not simply lose Margaret to a fever," Grace began. "He lost her because he was too afraid of his own father to fight for her when it mattered most." Eleanor said nothing, only waited. Margaret Sinclair was the daughter of a merchant family, respectable, but not titled, not the kind of match our father had planned for his only son. When Sebastian brought her to meet the family, our father made his disapproval known in ways I still find difficult to speak of, even now. Grace's hands twisted together in her lap. He humiliated her at dinner, in front of guests, questioning her family's business dealings, her education, her very right to sit at our table. And Sebastian said nothing. He sat there and let it happen. Why? Because he was 21, and terrified of what defying our father would cost him. His inheritance, his position, everything he had been raised to believe defined his worth as a man. Grace's voice had gone quiet, distant, as though pulling the memory up from somewhere she had buried it long ago. Margaret left that dinner in tears, and Sebastian let her walk to her carriage alone, rather than follow her out and face our father's anger a second time. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was not the man she had spoken with the night before, or perhaps it was exactly that man, before he had learned whatever painful lesson had reshaped him since. "He tried to make it right afterward," Grace continued, "wrote to her, visited when he could manage it without our father's knowledge. But the damage was done. Margaret's family, humiliated by the encounter, began pressuring her to end the engagement rather than continue courting disgrace. And Sebastian, still too afraid to openly defy our father, could not give her the one thing that would have settled the matter entirely: a public declaration, a wedding date set in stone regardless of anyone's approval. What happened? She grew ill that winter. The physicians called it a fever, and perhaps it was, in the way that fevers sometimes are simply the body's way of giving up when the heart has already surrendered first. Sebastian visited her as often as her family allowed, but by the time he finally found the courage to tell our father he intended to marry her regardless of consequence, it was too late. She died 3 days after he made that declaration. Eleanor sat in silence, absorbing the full weight of what Grace had shared, not simply a tragic loss, but a loss made heavier by guilt, by the knowledge that courage arrived too late to matter. "He has never forgiven himself," Grace said, "not truly. He built the life he has now, the careful distance he keeps from everyone, the marriages of convenience he agreed to without protest, as a kind of penance, as though never risking his heart again could somehow make up for the one time risking it might have saved someone, had he found the courage sooner." "Why are you telling me this?" Grace turned to look at Eleanor directly, her gray eyes so like her brother's that Eleanor felt a strange jolt of recognition. "Because last night, for reasons I do not fully understand myself, my brother sent word to me before dawn, a letter, delivered by his fastest rider, telling me what you had said to him and what he intended to do about the contracts. In 11 years since Margaret's death, Sebastian has never once written to me about anything that mattered, not truly. He writes about estate matters, about weather, about polite nothings that keep the distance between us comfortable and safe." She reached into her traveling cloak and withdrew a folded letter, worn soft at the creases from what appeared to be repeated reading during her journey. "This is what he wrote to me last night, after you left his study." Eleanor took the letter with hands that trembled slightly and read words meant for a sister, never intended for her own eyes, and yet somehow more honest for that very reason. "Grace, forgive the hour of this letter, but I find I cannot wait until morning to write it. Tonight a woman stood in my study and told me the truth about what our arrangement would cost her, and asked me plainly not to proceed with it. I expected to feel relief at the prospect of release from an obligation I never truly chose. Instead, I found myself wanting, for the first time since Margaret, to fight for something rather than simply accept whatever fate our father's arrangements demanded of me. I do not know what this means yet. I only know that I have spent 11 years building walls specifically designed to prevent exactly this feeling, and tonight those walls did not hold. I am frightened, Grace, in a way I have not allowed myself to feel since we buried her. But I find I would rather be frightened and honest than safe and hollow, as I have been for so long now. I do not know if Eleanor Whitmore will choose to stay after tomorrow, but I know that whatever she chooses, I intend to be the kind of man this time who does not let fear make the choice for me." Eleanor read the letter twice, her vision blurring slightly at the edges by the time she finished the second reading. "He is not the same man who let Margaret walk to her carriage alone," Grace said quietly. "He has spent 11 years becoming someone else entirely, someone so careful and so guarded that most people who meet him believe he feels nothing at all. But I know my brother, Miss Whitmore. I have watched him grieve in silence for over a decade, and I have never once, in all that time, seen him write words like these." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Grace, though something in her chest had shifted, had cracked open in a way she was not certain how to close again. "Why would he tell you this? Why would he let you see him so exposed?" "Because I am the only person left who remembers who he was before Margaret died," Grace said. "And I think, somewhere beneath all that careful control, he hoped that if he wrote it down and sent it to someone who would understand, it might become real enough that he could not talk himself out of it by morning." The two women sat together on the stone bench as the morning sun climbed higher over the garden, warming the roses that had not yet fully bloomed, and Eleanor found herself turning over an entirely new understanding of the man she had confronted the night before. "What do you intend to do?" Grace finally asked. "I do not know yet," Eleanor admitted. "I came to this garden seeking clarity, and instead I find myself more uncertain than when I arrived." "Perhaps uncertainty is not the enemy you believe it to be," Grace said, rising from the bench and smoothing her traveling cloak. "Perhaps it simply means you are finally being given room to feel something honestly, rather than accepting whatever certainty other people have decided for you." Grace turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Eleanor with an expression that carried something between hope and warning. "Whatever you decide, Miss Whitmore, know this. My brother has spent 11 years protecting himself from ever loving anyone strongly enough to lose them again. If you choose to stay, you will not simply be marrying a duke. You will be asking a deeply wounded man to risk everything he has spent over a decade building, on the possibility that this time, the outcome might be different. That is no small thing to ask of him, or of yourself." Grace walked back toward the house, leaving Eleanor alone in the garden with her thoughts, the folded contract still clutched in one hand, and the weight of everything she had just learned settling heavy and uncertain in her chest. Eleanor did not return to the house immediately. Instead, she wandered deeper into the estate's grounds, past the formal gardens into the wilder edges where her mother had once kept a small cottage for reading undisturbed, now mostly abandoned since her death. The cottage door creaked open at her touch, revealing a single room filled with dust motes dancing in the slanted morning light, her mother's old chair still positioned by the window, a stack of books untouched for 3 years gathering a soft layer of neglect. Eleanor sat in her mother's chair and allowed herself, for the first time since her mother's funeral, to weep freely for the woman who had never been given the choice Eleanor now held folded in her hands. Her mother had married for the same reasons Eleanor had been expected to marry: family obligation, financial necessity. A father's decision made without consultation of the daughter whose life it would shape, and her mother had smiled through it for years, weeping only in private, until the smiling and the weeping had worn her down to nothing at all. Eleanor had sworn, kneeling at her mother's grave, that she would never live the same silent, hollowed life. And last night, standing in the Duke's study, she had finally found the courage to act on that promise. But now, sitting in her mother's abandoned reading chair, with Grace's words echoing in her mind, Eleanor found herself confronting a question she had not expected to face. What if the choice before her was not simply between marriage and freedom, obligation and independence, but between two different kinds of courage entirely? The courage to walk away from an arrangement that frightened her, or the courage to stay and risk her heart with a man who had spent 11 years convincing himself that love was too dangerous a thing to survive twice. She thought of Sebastian's face in his study the night before, the careful way he had listened to her without interruption, the honesty he had offered her in return for her own. She thought of the letter Grace had shared, written in the raw hours before dawn, to a sister he rarely confided in, admitting fear he had not spoken of in over a decade. He was not asking her to save him from his grief. He was not pretending that marrying her would erase 11 years of careful walls, built brick by brick around his heart. He was simply offering her the truth and the choice, and trusting her to decide what to do with both. Eleanor rose from her mother's chair and looked out the small cottage window toward the main house in the distance, its stone walls warm in the late morning light. She had come to this estate prepared to fight for her freedom. She had not prepared herself to discover that freedom and connection were not opposites at all, but two things that could exist together, if both people involved were brave enough to build something honest rather than simply safe. The bells from the estate's small chapel rang out across the grounds, marking the hour, and Eleanor realized with a start that the morning had slipped away faster than she had noticed. Somewhere in the main house, her father waited anxiously for an answer that would determine his family's financial future. Her aunt waited with the peculiar hope Eleanor had seen flicker across her usually stern features. And somewhere in that house, Sebastian waited too, having given her the rare gift of time and choice, without demanding either be resolved on his terms. Eleanor stepped out of the cottage and began the walk back toward the main house, her heart no longer torn between two clear paths, but instead settling into something she had not expected to feel on what was supposed to have been her wedding day. Not certainty exactly, but something close enough to hope that she found she was no longer afraid to follow it. By the time Eleanor reached the edge of the formal garden, word of her long absence had clearly spread through the household. She could see figures moving anxiously past the tall windows of the drawing room, and as she approached the side entrance, her Aunt Charlotte emerged onto the terrace, her sharp face creased with worry rather than her usual stern composure. "There you are," Charlotte said, hurrying down the terrace steps. "Your father has worked himself into quite a state. He believes you have run off entirely, though where he imagines you might run to in the middle of the countryside, I cannot say." "I needed air," Eleanor said simply, "and time to think." "And did you find enough of both?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "I found more than I expected to." Charlotte studied her niece's face with an intensity that reminded Eleanor, briefly, of her own mother's expression whenever she suspected something important was being left unsaid. "Grace Ashworth came to find you in the garden. I saw her leave not an hour ago, looking as though she had traveled through the night to get here. She told me about Margaret." Charlotte's expression softened slightly. "Ah, you knew." Everyone in society of a certain age knows the story, though few speak of it directly. It was a scandal in its day, though a quiet one, buried beneath the family's careful management of it. A duke's son, engaged to a merchant's daughter, and a father who made his disapproval known so thoroughly that the poor girl wasted away from the strain of it. Charlotte's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I did not think it my place to share it with you before now. It seemed cruel to burden you with old grief on top of everything else you were already carrying. It changes things," Eleanor admitted. "Knowing what he lost, Knowing what it cost him to become the man who offered me that contract this morning. Does it change your answer? Eleanor looked back toward the house, toward the study window she knew belonged to Sebastian, though she could not see him from this distance. I am not certain I have an answer yet, but I no longer feel as though I am choosing between two simple things: marriage or freedom, safety or independence. What do you feel you are choosing between then? Whether I am brave enough to risk something honest, Eleanor said slowly, working the thought out as she spoke it aloud for the first time, with a man who has spent over a decade convincing himself that risking anything at all is too dangerous to survive. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, studying her niece with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. Your mother never had that choice, she finally said. Whatever you decide, Eleanor, know that the mere fact you are standing here weighing it as a genuine choice, rather than simply enduring whatever fate your father arranged, is more than most women of our family have ever been given. They walked together back toward the house, and as they crossed the threshold into the entrance hall, Eleanor found her father waiting near the base of the staircase, his face a study in barely contained panic. Eleanor, thank heaven, William said, hurrying forward. I feared the worst. Where have you been? Walking, father. Thinking. Thinking about what? The Duke has been most patient, but Mr. Price cannot remain indefinitely, and if word gets out that the wedding has been delayed without explanation, the damage to this family's reputation could be... Father. Eleanor's voice carried a firmness that stopped William mid-sentence. I understand what is at stake for this family. I have understood it for 3 years now, ever since Mother died and you first began speaking of arrangements and debts and the necessity of a favorable match. But I would ask that you allow me to make this decision in my own time, rather than pressing me toward whatever answer serves the family's finances most conveniently. William's mouth opened, then closed again, something like shame flickering across his tired features. I only wish to protect this family, Eleanor. I never meant for you to feel as though your own wishes did not matter. And yet they rarely have, until this morning, Eleanor said, not unkindly, but with the particular honesty that seemed to have become easier to access since the night before. I do not say this to wound you, father. I say it because I think, for the first time in a very long while, someone has finally asked me what I actually want, rather than simply telling me what I am required to accept. Her father's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him in a way that left him looking older and smaller than she had ever seen him. The Duke's offer this morning, the terms he proposed. I confess I do not fully understand a man who would offer such generous conditions with nothing required in return. Perhaps that is precisely the point, Eleanor said. Perhaps he is trying to prove that not every arrangement has to be built on obligation and fear. She left her father standing at the base of the staircase and made her way toward the study, her heart beating steadily now, no longer racing with uncertainty, but settling into something closer to resolve. She found Sebastian exactly where she expected, standing near the same window where he had stood the night before, though the morning light gave the room an entirely different character than the candlelit shadows of their first conversation. He turned when she entered, and something in his expression, carefully guarded though it was, betrayed a flicker of hope he could not quite suppress. You have been gone most of the morning, he said. I met your sister. Something shifted across his face, a complicated mixture of surprise and something that might have been relief. Grace came? She told me about Margaret, all of it, the dinner, your father's cruelty, the courage you found too late to save her. Eleanor watched his expression carefully as she spoke, and saw the old grief settle briefly over his features before he pushed it back down with the same careful control she imagined he had practiced for 11 years. She also showed me the letter you wrote her last night. Sebastian's jaw tightened. I did not intend for you to see that. I know, which is precisely why it mattered so much that I did. He turned away from her slightly, looking out the window at the garden beyond, his shoulders carrying a tension that had not been there the night before. I spent 11 years building a life where nothing could touch me deeply enough to break me the way her death did, and in the span of a single conversation, you managed to crack that entirely. I did not intend to. I know that too. He turned back to face her, and the careful control in his expression had softened into something more vulnerable, more honest than she had yet seen from him. But intention rarely changes outcome, Eleanor. You came to my study last night to ask for your freedom, and instead you gave me something I had spent over a decade avoiding entirely. The possibility that I might actually want something for myself again, rather than simply enduring whatever arrangement circumstance handed me. Eleanor crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she could see the fine details of exhaustion around his eyes, the evidence of a man who had likely not slept any more than she had. Your sister told me something else, she said. She said that if I chose to stay, I would not simply be marrying a duke. I would be asking a deeply wounded man to risk everything he built to protect himself, on the chance that this time things might turn out differently. She is not wrong. I have spent 3 years protecting my family from ruin, alone, without anyone ever asking whether the weight of it was too much to carry, Eleanor continued. I understand something about building walls to survive difficult things, Sebastian. I understand what it costs to consider tearing them down again. His eyes searched hers, something raw and unguarded moving beneath the careful composure he had maintained since she entered the room. Then you understand exactly what I am asking, if I ask you to stay. I do. And what have you decided? Eleanor reached into the fold of her dress and withdrew the contract he had given her that morning, still carefully folded, the ink of its unusual terms still fresh upon the page. I have decided, she said slowly, that I do not wish to sign this contract as it currently stands. Something flickered across Sebastian's face, a brief shadow of the resignation she imagined he had prepared himself for, the expectation of loss he had likely steeled himself against since the moment she left his study the night before. I understand, he said quietly, though the words carried none of their usual steadiness. You misunderstand me, Eleanor said, before he could retreat further into whatever careful distance he was already constructing to survive her rejection. I do not wish to sign a contract that grants me an escape clause for the first year, as though this marriage were something to be endured until I found sufficient reason to leave it. Sebastian's expression shifted, confusion replacing the resignation. Then what do you wish to sign? Something that assumes we are both choosing this, not out of obligation, and not out of fear of what happens if we do not. Something that assumes we intend to build an honest life together, rather than simply avoiding the dishonesty that nearly destroyed us both in different ways. Eleanor, her name, spoken with a rawness she had not yet heard from him, carried more weight than any formal declaration could have managed. Are you saying you wish to marry me? I am saying, Eleanor said carefully, that I came to your study last night prepared to beg you not to marry me, because I feared becoming a woman who smiles at dinners and weeps in private, the way my mother did. And I am standing here now, having learned that you carry your own version of that same fear, wondering if perhaps the answer was never simply refusing the marriage entirely, but refusing to build it on the same silence and obligation that hollowed out everyone who came before us. Sebastian closed the remaining distance between them, close enough now that Eleanor could see the exact moment hope overtook the careful guardedness he had maintained through their entire conversation. I cannot promise you that I know how to do this well, he said quietly. I have spent 11 years avoiding exactly this kind of honesty. I may fail you in ways I cannot yet anticipate. And I may fail you in turn, Eleanor said. I have spent 3 years learning to carry everything alone, and I am not certain I know how to share that weight with someone else, even someone willing to help carry it. Then perhaps, Sebastian said, we simply agree to learn together, rather than pretending either of us has already mastered it. Eleanor felt something in her chest finally settle, the tight uncertainty of the entire morning easing into something that felt, for the first time since her mother's death, like genuine hope rather than simple endurance. I would like new terms drawn up, she said. Terms that reflect a marriage built on choice, renewed daily, rather than obligation enforced by contract. Sebastian's mouth curved into the first genuine smile she had seen from him since their acquaintance began. something that transformed the careful composure of his features into an expression far younger, far less guarded than the Duke society knew him to be. "I believe," he said, "that can be arranged." Outside the study window, the household continued its anxious waiting, unaware that within these walls, an arrangement built on obligation and fear was quietly being reshaped into something neither party had expected to find. Word of the revised terms spread through the household within the hour, carried by servants who could not quite contain their curiosity about a duke who had rewritten his own marriage contract twice in a single morning. Mr. Edmund Price, the nervous solicitor, found himself summoned back to the study to draft an entirely new document, one that bore little resemblance to the standard arrangements he had spent his career preparing. "Your Grace," Edmund said carefully, reviewing the notes Sebastian had dictated to him, "these terms are, if you will forgive my saying so, entirely unprecedented. There is no clause regarding inheritance disputes, no provision for the estate should the marriage produce no heir, no standard language regarding—" "I am aware, Mr. Price," Sebastian said, glancing toward Eleanor, who sat near the window reviewing the draft alongside him. "That is rather the point. But surely some protection should exist, for both parties, in the event that—" "The protection exists," Eleanor interjected, "in the honesty of the arrangement itself. We are not attempting to anticipate every possible failure and guard against it with clever language. We are attempting to build something worth protecting in the first place." Edmund Price looked between the two of them with the particular bewilderment of a man whose entire professional training had prepared him for every circumstance except this one. "Very well," he finally said, gathering his papers. "I shall have the revised contract prepared within the hour." He left the study, muttering something under his breath about unconventional clients, and Eleanor found herself laughing for the first time that day, a sound that seemed to surprise Sebastian as much as it surprised her. "You have a rather wonderful laugh," he said. "I do not think I have heard it before. I have not had much occasion to use it recently. Then perhaps that changes going forward." The afternoon passed in a strange, suspended quality, neither of them quite believing the morning's transformation from confrontation to something far gentler and more hopeful. Word eventually reached William Whitmore that the marriage would proceed, though on terms he did not entirely understand, and his relief was so complete that he wept openly in the drawing room, an act Eleanor had not witnessed from her father since her mother's funeral. Charlotte, for her part, simply nodded when informed of the outcome, though Eleanor caught her aunt dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief later that afternoon, an uncharacteristic display of sentiment the older woman would likely deny to her dying day. The wedding itself, when it finally proceeded 3 days later rather than that same afternoon as originally planned, was a smaller affair than anyone had initially anticipated. Sebastian had insisted on the delay, wanting time for the new contract to be properly reviewed and understood by both families, rather than rushing into an arrangement neither of them had fully considered. Grace remained for the ceremony, standing beside her brother with an expression of quiet pride that Eleanor found herself deeply moved by, understanding now the weight of history contained in that simple gesture of support. The chapel was small, decorated simply with flowers gathered from the estate's own gardens rather than the elaborate arrangements originally planned for the larger, more formal wedding. Eleanor wore a gown of pale blue rather than the traditional white silk that had been prepared for the original ceremony, a small act of rebellion that felt appropriate given how differently this marriage had come to be than anyone had originally intended. As she walked down the short aisle toward Sebastian, she found herself thinking not of the fear that had driven her to his study 3 nights before, but of the strange and unexpected gift that fear had ultimately delivered. Not release from an unwanted obligation, but the discovery of a partnership built on something far more solid than convenience or duty. Sebastian watched her approach with an expression she had never seen on him before their acquaintance began, something entirely unguarded, entirely present, without the careful distance he had maintained for 11 years since Margaret's death. "You look terrified," she whispered when she reached him, unable to resist the small joke given how solemn his expression had become. "I am," he admitted quietly. "I have not allowed myself to want something this badly in a very long time. It is rather more frightening than I anticipated." "Good," Eleanor said. "I would not trust a man who claimed otherwise." The ceremony proceeded simply, vows exchanged that had been carefully revised from the standard language to reflect the honesty both of them had insisted upon in the contract itself. Not promises of eternal devotion sworn blindly, but commitments to choose each other daily, to speak truthfully even when truth proved difficult, to build something neither of them had been taught to expect from marriages arranged for convenience rather than genuine connection. When the ceremony concluded and Sebastian was permitted to kiss his bride, the small gathered crowd of family and close household staff erupted into applause, far more genuine than the polite formality typically expected at society weddings. The following months brought their own challenges, as any genuine partnership inevitably does. Eleanor found herself occasionally reverting to old habits, attempting to manage difficulties alone rather than sharing the burden as she had promised. And Sebastian, in turn, sometimes retreated into the careful emotional distance that had protected him for over a decade, particularly when conversations grew difficult or vulnerable. But unlike the arrangements either of them had witnessed growing up, silence never lasted long between them. Eleanor would find herself, hours after retreating into old patterns of solitary problem-solving, sitting across from Sebastian in the evening and admitting what she had been struggling with alone. And Sebastian, in turn, slowly began sharing pieces of himself he had kept guarded even from Grace, small confessions about grief and fear that had shaped him more thoroughly than he had ever allowed anyone to understand. 6 months into the marriage, Grace visited the estate again, this time not carrying urgent letters or difficult truths, but simply to spend time with the family she had distanced herself from for so many years following Margaret's death. Eleanor watched the careful, tentative rebuilding of the relationship between brother and sister with quiet satisfaction, understanding that her own marriage had somehow become the catalyst for healing that extended well beyond the two of them. "I did not expect this," Grace admitted to Eleanor one afternoon as they walked together through the same garden where their first conversation had taken place. "When I received Sebastian's letter that night, I feared I was traveling here to help him navigate the aftermath of a broken engagement, not to witness the beginning of something entirely unprecedented for him. I did not expect it either," Eleanor admitted. "I came to his study intending to refuse the marriage entirely. And yet, here you are." "Here I am," Eleanor agreed, watching Sebastian in the distance, walking the estate's boundary with his steward, discussing matters of harvest and tenant welfare with the same careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. "I think, in the end, I did not refuse the marriage at all. I simply refused to accept the version of it that would have hollowed me out, the way silence hollowed out my mother, and grief hollowed out your brother. What we built instead is something else entirely. What would you call it, if you had to name it?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, watching the late afternoon sun catch the edges of the estate she had once feared would become her prison, and had instead become something closer to home than she had known in years. "Honesty," she finally said. "Choice, renewed each day rather than assumed forever. I think that is what we built, in the end. Not a fairy tale, and not simply an escape from one. Something more difficult and more real than either." Grace smiled, an expression that carried both the weight of old grief and the genuine relief of watching her brother finally step beyond it. "Margaret would have liked you, I think. She had that same quality, that refusal to accept convenient silence over difficult truth. I am sorry I never had the chance to know her. I think," Grace said gently, "that in some way she is part of why you and Sebastian found each other at all. Her loss taught him the cost of silence, even if it took him 11 years to fully understand the lesson. And your courage, walking into his study that night, finally gave him the chance to apply what that terrible lesson had taught him." They continued their walk in comfortable silence, and Eleanor found herself thinking of that first terrified moment outside Sebastian's study door, her hand raised to knock, uncertain whether she possessed the courage to ask a duke not to marry her. She had never anticipated that the moment would become not an ending, but a beginning entirely unlike anything either of them had expected. A duke who could have simply refused her plea, or accepted her rejection without argument, had instead chosen a third path neither of them had known existed. Not marriage forced by obligation, and not freedom achieved through refusal, but something built deliberately, honestly, choice by choice, day by day. By the time winter arrived that year, bringing the first snow to settle over the estate's gardens where roses had once bloomed uncertain and tight-budded through that fateful morning, Eleanor found herself standing at the same window in Sebastian's study where she had first confronted him, watching snow fall gently over grounds that had witnessed the entire transformation of both their lives. Sebastian joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind in a gesture that had become familiar and comfortable between them, though it would have seemed impossible to either of them on that first tense night months before. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Any of it? The delay, the unconventional terms, the small wedding rather than the grand affair originally planned?" Eleanor leaned back against him, watching snow gather on the garden's stone paths below. "I regret nothing," she said honestly. "Though I confess I am grateful every single day that you chose to respond to my plea with curiosity rather than wounded pride." "I very nearly did respond with wounded pride," Sebastian admitted, "for perhaps the first 30 seconds after you spoke, before I understood what you were actually offering me." "And what was that?" "The truth," he said simply, "something I had spent 11 years avoiding, convinced it was safer to accept convenient silence than risk the vulnerability that honesty requires. You walked into my study prepared to sacrifice your own comfort for truth, and it forced me to consider whether I was brave enough to do the same." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him, studying the man who had once seemed so guarded, so carefully composed, and now stood before her entirely unguarded, entirely present. "Everyone was speechless," she said, smiling slightly, "when you handed me that contract, when you gave me the choice, instead of simply accepting my refusal or fighting to keep the arrangement as originally planned. No one expected that response." "I did not expect it either," Sebastian admitted. "I only knew, standing in that study after you left that first night, that I could not simply let you walk away without at least offering you something better than the silence and obligation I had watched destroy people I loved." Outside, the snow continued falling gently over the estate, covering the garden paths where Eleanor had once sat with Grace, learning the difficult truths that had ultimately brought her closer to the man she had originally come to refuse. The house behind them stood warm and lit against the winter evening, home now in a way that neither of them had expected when this unlikely story first began. Eleanor pressed her palm against Sebastian's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her hand, and understood finally what her mother had never been given the chance to know. That love, when built honestly rather than assumed through obligation, did not have to hollow a person out. It could, instead, become the very thing that made a person whole. "I am glad," she said softly, "that I knocked on your door that night." "I am glad," Sebastian replied, "that you did not let fear stop you from saying what needed to be said." Outside their window, the winter snow settled peacefully over grounds that had witnessed both an ending and a beginning, and inside, two people who had each learned the cost of silence in their own difficult ways stood together, having finally chosen honesty over fear, and found in that choice something neither of them had believed themselves capable of building again. The story that began with a plea never to marry had become, in the end, a marriage built on exactly the kind of truth that plea had originally demanded, and in the quiet warmth of that winter evening, neither Eleanor nor Sebastian could imagine having chosen any other path than the one that had, against every expectation, led them both home.